The hearing will come to order. Good morning and welcome to the Budget Committee's Members' Day hearing. I look forward to this annual hearing because it gives us the opportunity to hear from our colleagues on the budget issues of great importance to them. We appreciate the members who are taking time to appear before the committee this morning, and we look forward to your testimony. We're holding this proceeding virtually in compliance with the regulations for committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 965, carried over to the 117th Congress via House Resolution 8. Would like to remind members that we have established an email inbox for submitting documents before and during committee proceedings, and we have distributed that email address to your staff. Consistent with regulations, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition. We are not permitted to unmute members unless they explicitly request assistance. If I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask if you would like staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. They will not unmute your microphone under any other conditions. Members must have their cameras on and be visible on screen in order to be recognized. Members may not participate in more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. Now I will yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning and welcome to the Budget Committee's Member Day hearing. Members Day is a long-standing tradition in the Budget Committee. Crafting the budget resolution is not an easy task, so I look forward to this hearing because it gives us the opportunity to directly hear the priorities of our colleagues. This year's hearing, while virtual, will provide members with the same dedicated platform to voice their ideas, concerns, and aims. While we all look forward to returning to pre-pandemic life and serving the American people from our Cannon hearing room, in order to continue to prioritize the health and safety of members, staff, witnesses, the court reporter, members of the media, House recording studio staff, and others, we will continue to conduct official committee business virtually until the public health experts advise us otherwise. Before we get to our witnesses, I want to say that I am beyond proud of the Budget Committee's central role in enacting President Biden's American Rescue Plan. Because of our work, relief checks are already being deposited in Americans' bank accounts. Furloughs have already ended for tens of thousands of workers. The unemployment compensation cliff was averted, and our economic future is bright. And now, hopefully, with an end to this pandemic in sight, Congress must keep our focus on addressing the economic fallout that has hurt so many American workers, families, communities, and our economy. Good governing and smart budgeting require that we be honest about what we face as a nation, that we recognize that low inflation and persistently low interest rates give us the fiscal space needed to make responsible and substantial investments in our country. If we are to best serve the American people, we must start this process by evaluating how we can use this fiscal space to foster a strong, inclusive, and stable recovery from this pandemic and build a better, fairer economy than we have had before. How we can use our resources to ensure that every American child is fed, has a home to fall asleep in each night, and the education needed to reach his or her fullest of potential. This is about leveraging the predicted explosion in economic growth following the American Rescue Plan to prevent a jobless recovery. It's about generating new opportunities so hardworking Americans can provide for their families today and long into the future, ensuring that after a lifetime of work, Americans have the safe and secure retirement they've been promised. To build a budget to serve our nation, our committee will get as much input as possible. We will listen to our constituents, review the president's budget requests, review views and estimates from authorizing committees, and hear from outside experts and advocates. At the end of this process, our goal is to construct a budget that reflects American priorities and meets our country's needs. This hearing is a vital piece of the process. I'm excited about the important work ahead of us, and I look forward to working alongside our committee members, the ranking member, House leadership, the Biden-Harris administration, and all of my House colleagues to lead our nation forward. I'd also like to thank members for taking time out of their busy schedules and appearing before the committee today. With that, I would like to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Smith of Missouri, for his opening remarks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding today's Member Day hearing. This committee and its members have been rather busy these past few weeks. Unfortunately, it is regretful that a lot of that work was done with the aim of pushing a nearly $1.9 trillion bailout bill out the door as quickly as possible, affording as little amount of debate, forethought, or review of existing resources as possible. On the last point, Republican members of this committee have called for an accounting of the approximately $1 trillion from previously enacted COVID packages still unspent, an accounting we should have had before another $1.9 trillion was signed into law. Going forward, this committee has a responsibility and obligation to American taxpayers to provide thorough oversight of the now $3 trillion in taxpayer money approved in the last 90 days alone. Now we are hearing of an unelected, non-Senate confirmed czar based in California overseeing this fund. What will their reporting obligation be to this committee? What reports will they produce? How will they measure success? When will we know if some of this money can be returned to the taxpayer? The American people are owed at least that level of transparency. Speaking of transparency, since taking office, President Biden has found time to enact a sweeping series of executive orders, some of which fired American workers and others have worsened a crisis at the southern border by ending things like the stay in Mexico policy, a return to catch and release, and even rolling back the emergency declaration at the southern border and halting wall construction. The president has also found time to travel the country, telling Americans that Washington just borrowed another $1.9 trillion to spark a recovery that is actually already occurring. Sadly, apparently he's found no time to send Congress a budget to account for these and future policies. In fact, it has been 50 days since President Biden was supposed to submit a budget under the deadline established by the 74 Budget Act. As of March 16th, President Biden now holds the record for the latest a president has ever submitted a first year in office budget outline to Congress in the modern budget era. We haven't even received an outline of a plan, or for that matter, a date certain when we will see a budget. This is not just some exercise. Budgets matter. As Speaker Pelosi likes to say, show me your budget, show me your values. What are we then to take by a lack of budget from the president over 60 days into his presidency? It is my understanding, Mr. Chairman, that you all plan to do a fiscal year 2022 budget just as soon as you see something from the president. I hope you will push as strongly as we have to get such a budget from the president, and so we can get this important process moving forward in a serious and transparent manner. It is no secret that Democrats wish to impose some form of a Green New Deal-like program on America, as well as a broader Washington intrusion into our healthcare. Just yesterday, it was reported the administration is considering a $3 trillion plan covering any number of policy areas. There's been plenty of talk about raising taxes. Where's the budget plan for all of that? Where's the accounting for how high those taxes will need to go or debt will need to rise to satisfy that agenda? Right now, we don't know. We don't know because the Biden administration has not shown the American people a plan. And we need to look no further than the current crisis at the border for why such transparency matters to policy making. It is costing taxpayers roughly $775 per day to provide room and board for each unaccompanied minor who crosses the southern border. More than 9,000 minors came in February 2021. At just the current rate, the projected cost just this year to care for minors crossing the border is $9 billion. By comparison, we spend roughly $35 per student per day for K through 12 education in this country. So we are spending 22 times that cost per day per child at the border. This is the result of the actions or lack of actions we see from the administration when it comes to our border. But those harmful policies are part of a broader agenda for which we need an accounting from the Biden administration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to working with you as we carry out the duties and responsibilities of this committee.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, for your opening statement. As a reminder, members appearing before the committee today will have 5 minutes to give their oral remarks, and their written statements will be made part of the formal hearing record. In addition, members of the committee will be permitted to question witnesses following their statements. But out of consideration of our colleagues' time, I would ask that you please keep your comments brief. We will have 4 separate panels today, each one with 3 members, 3 of our colleagues. I would now like to call up our first panel, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman. Without objection, any written documents you submit to hpcdocuments@mail.house.gov before the end of the day will be entered into the record. Without objection, so ordered. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud, for 5 minutes. You may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth. Thank you, Ranking Member Smith. Thank you for working with us to be able to present this today. We'll always look forward to this day. I am in rural Texas, so this will be a good case for rural broadband as well. We'll see how that goes. So thanks again for having us today. This committee is tasked, of course, with the important constitutional obligation placed on Congress in Article 1, Section 8 to determine how much revenue should be collected from taxpayers and how it should be spent. The budget process is vital because it's within that budget framework that we evaluate proposed legislation to ensure we're spending within agreed upon spending limits. At least that's how it's supposed to work. Last year and the year before, I came to talk to you about a bill I introduced, H.R. 638, the Cost Estimates Improvement Act, which would require the CBO and JCT to include debt servicing costs in their estimates. I ask that you include it as part of the fiscal year 2020 and the fiscal year 2021 budget process. I've reintroduced that bill again and ask you to consider it as part of the fiscal year 2022 budget process. I promise you that should the committee include my legislation and enact it into law, I will not come again next year. But if not, I may be here again next year. So, Mr. Chairman, I do not have the luxury of ignoring the true costs of our spending decisions. Our nation's outstanding debt is $28 trillion. For reference, when I testified a little over a year ago, our nation's debt stood at $23.4 trillion. What's worse is, should the Senate pass and the president sign the bill that was approved by the House last week to essentially exempt $1.9 trillion from having to be paid for, it would add that straight to the nation's debt. These numbers are big that it's hard for the average person to comprehend, but they represent a real threat to our nation's financial future. And we're increasing, as we're increasing the deficit, these alarming rates without a full and complete picture of the legislation we're voting on in Congress, because we regularly do not consider the interest costs. As the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget pointed out just a couple weeks ago, this year the federal government will spend $300 billion on interest payments on the national debt. This is the equivalent of nearly 9% of all federal revenue collection and over $2,400 per household. The federal government spends more on interest than on science, space, technology, transportation, and education combined. The household share of federal interest is larger than the average household spending on many typical expenditures, including gas, clothing, education, or personal care. The folks back home understand this. If they were budgeting for a monthly car payment and only considered the list price of the car itself and didn't factor in the extra cost for the interest payments, they might discover they actually couldn't afford the car. In essence, this is what Congress does each and every year as we consider proposals that do not include the interest costs. This distorts congressional decision-making in favor of more spending and debt accumulation than otherwise might be the case. Simply put, including the debt servicing costs in legislation will better equip lawmakers to make informed spending decisions. My legislation also does one important thing. It would help lawmakers. It would require estimates to include a list of duplicate programs with the covered legislation. If cost estimates were required to point out such duplication, it might give members pause before voting to spend taxpayer dollars to create more duplicate programs or expand existing programs that duplicate others. But the good news is that while the legislation required consideration of interest costs is preferred, we do not need to wait for legislation to pass for us to begin to count the real cost of proposed legislation. Last year, I sent both the chairman and ranking member of this body, as well as your counterparts in the Senate, a bipartisan letter signed by myself and 56 colleagues. I'll be leading a similar letter this year. On the letter, we ask that you direct the Congressional Budget Office to begin including debt servicing costs in all legislative cost estimates produced. Mr. Chairman, reining in our debt and deficits only gets harder the longer we wait. That is in part because our interest rates have been historically low. Again, as the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget pointed out just a couple weeks ago, higher interest rates will mean higher interest payments and deficits. For example, if the interest rates were 1% higher than projected for all of 2021, interest costs would total $530 billion, more than the cost of Medicaid. If interest rates were 2% higher, interest costs would total $750 billion, which is more than the federal government spends on defense or Medicare. We owe it to our constituents, particularly future generations, to make spending decisions with the most accurate information possible. This isn't a red or blue issue, a Republican or Democrat issue. This is simple good governance. I hope you consider these cost estimate reforms as an important step toward improving our budget process. And thank you again for the opportunity for myself and other members to appear before you today.
Thank you, Mr. Cloud, for your testimony. Members who have their cameras on may now unmute to ask questions. Does any member of the committee wish to ask a question of Mr. Cloud?
No.
Seeing none, I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Tonko.
Thank you and good morning, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Smith and members of the committee. Thank you for the work on the American Rescue Plan. It's been a great help to my district. Thank you for this opportunity to testify on the fiscal year 22 budget resolution. America faces many interesting national challenges. Congress must advance a budget resolution that reflects this. President Biden understands that reducing climate pollution is not just scientifically necessary, it is also a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to propel our economy forward by investing in programs that put millions of Americans to work rebuilding our roads, bridges, electric grid, water systems, broadband networks, and buildings. The president has called this Build Back Better. To me, Build Back Better means rebuilding our economy for a more competitive future, not the fading dynamics of the past. America's new generation of global economic leadership starts with supporting new technologies, advanced manufacturing, and resilient infrastructure that we incorporate in every community. Certainly, taking bold action now will make us healthier, safer, and more competitive for the rest of this century. I propose 3 principles for our Build Back Better budget. Jobs. Focus on smart, strategic investments that create and retain American jobs while modernizing our infrastructure, reducing pollution, and enhancing U.S. competitiveness, specifically by strengthening domestic manufacturing and associated supply chains. American workers. Support American workers by ensuring every project built with federal funding upholds strong domestic content and prevailing wage requirements. Where appropriate, major projects should incorporate project labor agreements and other pro-worker practices. Better, healthier outcomes for everyone. Promote equity and environmental justice with investments that reach into every community. We can certainly start by ensuring universal access to clean water, clean air, and opportunities to share in clean energy prosperity. Congress should back Congress should seek to fulfill President Biden's Justice 40 commitment. With congressional leadership, we can have every child in America get a pollution-free ride to school on a clean, safe, American-made bus. We can remove every lead service line from our drinking water systems and provide clean water for every American. We can put our building trades to work building resilient, next-generation infrastructure, including a smart electric grid and vast clean electricity resources. We can invest in America's researchers and manufacturers to develop innovative technologies and ensure America reaps those rewards of these emerging industries. We know this will create new economic opportunities across our country if we are willing to make this commitment. My district is an example of this. We are hundreds of miles from any offshore wind site, but because New York's commitment to wind energy, the Port of Albany will soon become home to hundreds of new manufacturing jobs. With this in mind, the Energy and Commerce Committee has developed several proposals to make investments in our transition to a resilient, clean economy, covering dozens of programs at the EPA and the DOE. Finally, I would caution against a myopic focus on shovel-ready projects. While we certainly want to maximize job creation in our public investments, shovel-ready requirements can worsen the growing divide that exists between communities that are thriving and those that are struggling. Larger and wealthier communities are the ones that can afford the design and engineering work needed for a potential project to become shovel-ready. we need to ensure disadvantaged communities receive funding for this critical early stage work. In the 2009 Recovery Act, some of the most impactful investments, including the very first ARPA E-grants, had a longer time horizon, but still delivered significant benefits. Mr. Chair, we find ourselves at a moment of profound need, not just for climate action, but for vast rebuilding of our economy and our institutions. This budget is an opportunity for us to meet that need. If we intend to lead this nation in ways that avoid the most dangerous and irreversible aspects of climate change, we cannot wait. But for as much as we stand to lose from inaction, we stand to gain even more from a transition to a clean economy that will create existing opportunities that will benefit America's workers and communities. That is, if we act boldly and thoughtfully. I believe we must be prepared to deliver these investments through whatever process or procedure is available to us. I urge you to advance a budget resolution that reflects this moment of national need for all of us and for generations that will follow. I again thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Taco. Does any member have a question they would like to pose to Mr. Taco? Seeing none, now, thank you, Mr. Taco. I now welcome Mr. Whitman of Virginia to the committee, and you have 5 minutes to him for his statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Smith. I really appreciate you allowing me to testify before you and the members of the Budget Committee today. And I'm honored to highlight some of the perspectives I, as well as my constituents, have to improve the operations of the United States Congress and the budget process. In order to craft a responsible budget plan that addresses the needs of the United States, Congress must make the difficult but essential decisions about spending and challenging head-on the fiscal threats we face. Our repeated failure to control federal spending and address our mounting debt truly is the greatest long-term danger to this nation. Congress should fulfill their constitutional duty to produce a budget resolution that puts our nation on a fiscally sustainable path. Sound fiscal footing fosters an environment for a strong economy, opportunities for growth, and prosperity for all people. If we keep letting our debt spiral out of control, we put our country at risk of a financial crisis. The federal government has an outstanding public debt of more than $28 trillion. Every year since 1997, Congress has failed to maintain a fiscally responsible budget and instead has relied too much on raising the debt ceiling. Our current normal of not passing a balanced budget is irresponsible and poses a major national security threat. Both parties have failed to restore regular order in the budget and appropriations process and have become comfortable with passing irresponsible continuing resolutions and omnibus spending legislation. To address this issue, I have introduced multiple pieces of legislation. First, the No Budget, No Pay Act. The No Budget, No Pay Act will prohibit members of the House or Senate from receiving pay if their respective chamber does not pass a budget by April 15th of each year. You cannot continue to budget on this step-by-step process and create the certainty necessary for the federal agencies and the American people. The next bill, Inaction Has Consequences Act. The Inaction Has Consequences Act mandates that if members don't complete appropriations bills by the end of the fiscal year, their pay is withheld. If members of Congress cannot get their most basic responsibility of funding our government done, we all must be held accountable. Third, the Stay on Schedule resolution. The Stay on Schedule resolution changes congressional procedure to prohibit the House from taking a recess in August unless it has passed all 12 appropriations bills individually by July 31st of 2021. This resolution, in conjunction with my other legislation, the No Budget, No Pay Act and the Inaction Has Consequences Act, will put the proper accountability measures in place to ensure Congress gets its primary job done on time. It's time to finally pass these measures. They will hold members accountable to a higher standard and help us complete the work that the people of the United States expect us to do. Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Smith, thank you for allowing me the time to testify before you today. I look forward to working with you and the rest of the committee to restore America's fiscal footing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Whitman. Does any member have a question of Mr. Whitman?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Ranking Member Smith.
Yeah, I have a quick question of the representative.
Sure.
Thank you. Representative, how does the dysfunction in the budget process impact the DoD and the DoD operations?
Well, Ranking Member Smith, it's completely disruptive to certainty in the national defense realm. As you know, we have long-term funding needs to do things like build aircraft, to build ships. And when the stream of funding is interrupted by a continuing resolution, many of those efforts come to a halt or they're suspended temporarily, which actually results in a waste of money. In fact, I go back to a previous Secretary of the Navy's comment when he was asked at a House Armed Services Committee hearing, what was the fiscal impact of continuing resolutions? And he said that from 2009 to 2017, it resulted in the waste of $4 billion just for the United States Navy. He said, that's not setting money aside. He said, that's putting $4 billion into a trash can and burning it. That's the impact that it has on not only our nation's fiscal responsibilities in responsibly budgeting and making sure the money gets used in the right way and not wasted, but it also interrupts our effort to modernize, our efforts to make sure we keep up with our adversaries. And in today's world, we cannot afford either. We can't afford the wasting of those dollars, and we can't afford the interruptions of making sure that we keep up with our adversaries.
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you.
Thank the ranking member, and I will just add to that I think you get bipartisan agreement on the trouble with continuing resolutions. I'm not sure anyone wants to proceed on that basis, and many of us have significant amounts of research universities in our districts, and the toll that CRs take on vital research is equally disruptive. And so anyway, I appreciate that question, your answer, Mr. Whitman. So are there any further questions or comments? Then this panel is excused. Thank you very much for your testimony. The panel number 2 at this point is Representative Holmes Norton from the District of Columbia and Representative Graves of Louisiana. I now recognize and welcome to the committee Representative Holmes Norton from the District of Columbia for 5 minutes.
Put me on. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today. I ask that you mark up my federal government Advertising Equity Accountable Act, designated as HR 2576 in the 16th Congress, which would require all federal agencies to include in their annual budget requests to Congress the amount they spend on advertising contracts with small disadvantaged businesses and businesses owned by minorities and women. This bill would require federal agencies to provide prior and projected total expenditures for such contracts. The past 2 years, representatives, working with Representative Barbara Lee, we've been able to get reports accompanying the appropriation bills to direct agencies to provide this information in their budget requests. This bill, which had 13 co-sponsors last Congress, would make such reporting mandatory every year. In 2007, the Government Accountability Office examined spending on advertising contracts with minority-owned businesses by 5 agencies: Department of Defense, of Treasury, Health and Human Services, Interior, and Natural Aeronautics and Space Administration, and found that only 5% of the $4.3 billion available for advertising contracts went to minority businesses. In April 2016, several members of Congress joined a letter to the Government Accountability Office requesting information on the amount of federal advertising dollars spent on small disadvantaged businesses and businesses owned by minorities and women. In response to our request, the Government Accountability Office released a report in July 2018, which showed that in fiscal year 2017, only 16% of federal government's advertising contract obligations went to small disadvantaged businesses and businesses owned by minorities and women. The federal government is the largest advertiser in the United States. The Government Accountability Office findings make it clear that there is still much progress to be made. This bill would require the regular collection of information on federal advertising contracts with small disadvantaged businesses and businesses owned by women and minorities, promoting transparency and encouraging federal agencies to strive to reach these constituencies. The regular collection of information on federal advertising contracts with small disadvantaged businesses, those owned by women and minorities, along with the provision of this information to legislators and stakeholders, is essential to bridging the divide between what government statistics show and a more inclusive advertising landscape. This bill would achieve these goals while also promoting transparency and encouraging federal agencies to strive to reach minorities who often receive their daily news from smaller media outlets that serve communities of color. The requirement that agencies submit prior and projected information regarding the amount of advertising dollars spent with small disadvantaged businesses, those owned by business minorities and women, would allow federal agencies to evaluate their progress over time. The regular collection of this information would also demonstrate that the promotion of equity in advertising and in all areas of government should be a continuous effort that is important to the mission of every agency. I ask that you mark up this important bill, and I thank you for your consideration, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Holmes Norton. And are there any questions of Ms. Norton? Seeing none, I now welcome to the committee and yield 5 minutes to Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Unmute you. There you go.
All right, got it. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Smith. I appreciate the opportunity to join you today. Mr. Chairman, first of all, I'd like to associate myself with Congressman Whitman's comments. I think that his perspective is really important in regard to the stopping and going of government. In a previous life, I worked for a large infrastructure program at the state level. And one of the frustrations we often had was watching the spigot turn on and off, the inconsistency, the repetitive mobilization and demobilization for projects related to infrastructure was incredibly expensive and frustrating. So, Mr. Chairman, just big picture, I'd like to make one suggestion as we move forward. Of course, we're all aware of the rumors in a large infrastructure bill. The federal government needs to decide what its role is. Virtually every constituent that comes to us will ask for that's seeking funding. We can find a different grant program or some type of assistance that's available at the federal level. And it really seems like that rather than being a reliable federal partner, the federal government has a program that effectively throws a nickel at every $10 problem across the country, and we never get things done. And so I just ask as you all move forward that you think very carefully about what the role of the federal government is. What is our objective in ensuring that we're a consistent federal partner that is actually working to fulfill a mission and get projects completed rather than, as I said a few minutes ago, throwing a nickel at every $10 problem across the country and never, ever finishing these projects. But Mr. Chairman, more importantly, I'd like to turn to a few bills that we have either introduced or working on now. In 2005, the Office of Management and Budget established an administrative pay-go, and certainly you're all very familiar with the congressional pay-go that requires that we offset spending whenever we introduce legislation. The administrative pay goes a little bit more murky in that compliance with it, how it applies to different administrative decisions is less clear. What we've seen is this very strict rule often applied in the Congress where, once again, if we introduce legislation that spends dollars or affects income, we've got to find ways to offset it. At the federal level, just in the few years I've been in Congress, I've witnessed repeatedly where the administration has come in, they've taken discretionary executive actions, and they have caused extraordinary impacts in either spending or in reduced revenue coming to the federal government. And so effectively, this administrative pay-go concept designed to address budget neutrality at the administrative level, it's not working. And it seems like that rather than having a very strict process at the congressional level or in the legislature, and then allowing the federal government at the administrative level, administrative branch, to make wild variations in income or in revenue, it's inappropriate. It's not the appropriate balance, and I don't think it often reflects the checks and balances that our founders intended. So 3 pieces of legislation that we're working on. Number 1, bipartisan legislation we've introduced called the Prove It Act. It's actually passed the House of Representatives twice, and our great friends in the Senate have failed to see the wisdom associated with the legislation. But what it would do is, as you know, whenever regulations are proposed, there's a cost associated with those regulations, and it's often a guesstimate. We don't ever come back and look at the accuracy of the estimate. What happens if someone estimated it was $5 million in compliance, but it ended up being 10 billion? That may deviate significantly from congressional intent. And obviously the cost imposed on families and businesses is extraordinary. So the Prove It Act requires that we actually do a look back to determine the accuracy of these budget estimates or the regulatory impact estimates, and if appropriate, revisit the regulation if it's way out of whack. Number 2, this bill we haven't introduced yet, but working on legislation that would require that Congress effectively assign a regulatory budget to legislation, therefore helping to preserve congressional intent on legislation as we pass it. So if we pass legislation, we direct the administration to do something, we would establish a regulatory budget with that legislation. Let me say it again, therefore ensuring congressional intent and don't allow the administrations to wildly vary interpretations or application of the law. And the last one is actually applying a regulatory budget across agencies, similar to we do with appropriations, to help contain or, once again, preserve congressional intent in regard to the discretionary actions of the administration. So urge your consideration of these ideas and yield back.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Graves, for your testimony. Does any member have a question of Mr. Graves? Seeing none, those are the 2 members of our second panel, so you are excused, and thank you all for your testimony. The third panel will include Representative Moore of Wisconsin, Representative Kilmer of Washington, and Representative Timmons of South Carolina. So Ms. Moore, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee. No, she's there. Representative Moore, are you there? All right, well, we'll come back to her, and now recognize Mr. Kilmer of Washington for 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chairman Yarmuth and Ranking Member Smith, thank you for hosting today's Member Day hearing and for your leadership. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about 2 subjects. First, some bipartisan recommendations for improving the budget process that were unanimously approved by the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. The Select Committee's guiding principle is to make Congress work better so it can better serve the American people. And during the 116th Congress, members of the Select Committee worked with you, Mr. Chair, and with Ranking Member Womack and the Budget Committee staff to identify a set of bipartisan recommendations focused on modernizing the budget process. And I know Vice Chair Timmons will speak to some of that as well. In doing so, we relied extensively on the work of the Joint Select Committee on Budget and Appropriations Process Reform, on which I served alongside Chair Yarmuth and Ranking Member Womack. The Joint Committee's draft legislation formed the foundation for the recommendations Vice Chair Timmons and I will share with you today. We understood that process reforms alone can't force Congress to reach budget deals, but process matters because it determines how we enact policy. A strong bipartisan process can generate member buy-in, and that's enormously important when it comes to reaching a deal. As a first step, the Select Committee recommended requiring an annual fiscal state of the nation. A yearly fiscal state of the nation discussion will help facilitate budget negotiations by establishing a common fact base based on nonpartisan information. We also recommended enhancing the budget submission process from the executive branch. Congress requires critical data from the executive branch to begin the budget building process. The Congressional Budget Office cannot begin constructing its baseline for the upcoming fiscal year without data that is normally transmitted with the president's budget request. And without the CBO's baseline, Congress generally can't begin writing its budget resolution. To create additional time for developing the baseline and therefore the budget resolution and various appropriations bills, we recommended that the executive branch be required to provide a supplemental budget submission that's separate from the president's policy proposals no later than December 1st of each calendar year. That simple requirement would allow CBO to begin constructing the baseline and subsequently enabled the budget and appropriation committees to begin preliminary work in writing the budget resolution and appropriations bills earlier in the process. The Select Committee also agreed with the Joint Committee's assessment that including information about tax expenditures would encourage transparency and bring needed flexibility to the budget process. I know Vice Chair Timmons will cover some additional terrain from the committee's recommendations, and in sharing some of the Select Committee's recommendations with you today, Vice Chair Timmons and I hope we can work with the Budget Committee on bipartisan reforms to modernize the process, to eliminate delays and dysfunction that don't serve the interests of the American people. On behalf of the Select Committee, I appreciate your consideration. I'm happy to provide additional information to support your work. Outside of the work of the Select Committee, I'd also like to just take a minute and a half and highlight a topic that's also worthy of this committee's consideration. Many of you, like me, represent communities that were hurting well before any of us had heard of COVID-19. In fact, I grew up on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State and was in high school when the timber industry took it on the chin. The economic change and the economic distress that we have experienced is not unique to my region. Indeed, too many communities are being left behind, with stressed labor markets, insufficient job opportunities, and the real fear that our top export will be young people. In examining these challenges, I've identified three problems that should shape our response. First, communities that are struggling simply do not have the capacity to navigate the complex systems of grants and loans that exist across a multitude of federal agencies. Many can't afford grant writers. Second, while one-year grants are helpful, it's worth recognizing that the struggles facing these communities didn't arise in 1 year. While 1 year of support is helpful, research tells us that a sustained approach is needed. And finally, it's important to acknowledge that different communities have different problems, so a one-size-fits-all approach won't work. In my district alone, there are some distressed communities for whom the primary issue is the need for workforce. One community needs help with brownfield redevelopment, another with greenfield site development. One community needs broadband and another needs funding to address persistent flooding. To address this, I'm working on a proposal for flexible long-term grant assistance to persistently distressed communities. When we work on a recovery package or an infrastructure package in the weeks and months ahead, it's important that it doesn't simply amplify existing inequities between communities that have enjoyed tremendous economic growth and others that are being left behind. Rather, we need to make sure that people have economic opportunity, regardless of what zip code they live in. I provided a 2-pager along with my testimony and would invite your committee's partnership on this effort. So thank you again for your leadership and for the opportunity to speak before the committee today. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kilmer. Does anyone have a question for Mr. Kilmer?
Yes, I do, Mr.
Yes.
Chair. Thank you so much, Mr. Kilmer, for your testimony, and I find that really very interesting and dynamic, the notion of supporting distressed communities and those that have been left behind. In your 2-pager, which I'm really anxious to read, do you lay out how that determination is made as to what those communities would look like? This is in some ways reminiscent to me of our whip Clyburn's 3-2010 program, where he's trying to identify communities that have had 30 years of poverty at 20, poverty in communities that have been in poverty levels for protracted periods of time. Are you tying it to anything specifically?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We've been working with an economist named Tim Bardick, who's done some pretty detailed work on distressed communities. And we've also been getting technical assistance from EDA so that if an idea like this moved forward, it would be done in a way that got assistance to the communities that need it most. But I certainly appreciate the question.
Thank you.
Any other member have a question for Mr. Kilmer? Seeing none, I now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, for 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for having me. Ranking Member Smith, thank you both for your leadership on this committee and for holding today's Member Day hearing to listen to the concerns and priorities of members of Congress. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss some of the budget recommendations made by the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. The Select Committee made over 90 recommendations to the House last year, including recommendations involving the budget process and how we think it can be improved. These were all unanimous. Our founding fathers separated the powers given to each branch of government. Congress was given the power of the purse and controlled our nation's entire annual budget and funding process for years. However, the creation of an initial budget was eventually moved from Congress to the executive branch. And this is the system we still use today. However, the budget process today rarely follows the system initially established. As noted in our committee's final report for the 116th Congress, it is more like regular disorder. One of the more radical changes from congressional procedure is the lack of regular order in our budget and appropriations process. Instead, Congress and the president tend to rely on omnibus legislation and continuing resolutions, as we have all seen in past years. Congress has failed and is failing to meet its Article 1 duties. And one of the clearest examples we have is the worsening of the budget and appropriations process. One of the recommendations made by the Select Committee is to require a biennial budget resolution while maintaining the annual appropriations bills. Unfortunately, over the last several years, the budget resolution has become more and more a partisan document, used by both sides of the aisle to emphasize their own policy preferences, and in some cases, a political mover for Senate passage of non-budget related bills. To be clear, both sides are guilty of this. When the budget process is intentionally delayed and used for political purposes, it delays the incredibly important and constitutionally mandated responsibilities of Congress. If we were to require a biennial budget resolution while maintaining annual appropriations bills, the process would be more efficient and we would be able to plan ahead, avoiding unnecessary delays. A biennial budget resolution would also give Congress ample time to conduct oversight on federal agencies and departments. When both appropriators and authorizers have more certainty, they are able to give more attention to those bodies they fund and oversee. This allows Congress to better ensure that appropriated funds, taxpayer dollars, are being used responsibly and that authorized programs are carried out in line with congressional intent. In line with requiring a biennial budget resolution, a realistic deadline for Congress to complete action on a biennial budget is also needed. Congress has consistently failed to adopt a budget resolution by the deadline in statute, April 15th. As you know, we will once again fail to meet this deadline this year. The current deadline does not reflect a realistic timeline and only further delays the budget process. A later deadline for the first year of the biennium would give Congress sufficient time and opportunities to finish its work. Simply requiring a biennial budget resolution does not immediately fix the problems that we face in Congress, but it is a step in the right direction. But in order to maximize taxpayer dollars and ensure that congressional intent is implemented, the Budget and Appropriations Committees should adopt biennial budget resolutions going forward. A 2-year budget will also allow us to take a good look at our spending and our budget deficit. With our national debt quickly reaching $30 trillion, a biennial budget provides the opportunity to correct course and become good stewards of taxpayer dollars, rather than relying on 11th hour continuing resolutions or bloated omnibus bills that only further exacerbate the problems at hand. As a former member of the Budget Committee, I understand the unique challenges of the work its members do, and I believe a biennial budget would help us overcome some of the challenges facing us today. The congressional budget and appropriations process, as it stands today, is in desperate need of reform. Delays and worse, inaction have become the norm. The unfortunate results are not just ineffectiveness and lack of accountability of Congress. They are increased delays throughout Congress as a whole and strained relationships with the executive branch. Vital legislation is forced to the sidelines as we hurriedly try to fund the government through omnibus bills and CRs, and without on-time individual appropriations bills, federal programs and agencies are hamstrung by the uncertainty of future funding. One of Congress's core responsibilities outlined in Article 1 of the Constitution is allocating funds for the federal government, and it is not currently meeting that key responsibility. By adopting these recommendations that both Chair Kilmer and I have spoken about, we can begin to remove the roadblocks that have only further delayed and polarizations in this body. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you today. I hope that moving forward, the Select Committee can be a resource to you, and I look forward to working with you this Congress to help reform our budget process and make Congress work more efficiently. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Timmons. Does anyone have a question of Mr. Timmons? Seeing none, I now recognize the gentlewoman from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, for 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member. Thank you, all the members of the Budget Committee. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to come before this committee. You know, I served on the Budget Committee for over 10 years, and I know how hard every member in both party works to put this budget together, no matter where they land on the policy imperatives. You know, I have so much to talk about, but I've been chastened by the 5-minute rule. So I want to focus my remarks on how provisions of the American Rescue Plan can become foundational for reforming our public assistance programs going forward. By making the provisions adopted in the American Rescue Plan relating to the child tax credit, making it permanent, and by continuing to expand access to the Earned Income Tax Credit. I have a proposal that you'll hear more about in the future called the Worker Act, which recognizes the work of the unpaid work of caretakers, expanding childcare, the Affordable Care Act, and SNAP to those workers who are described by the Poor People's Campaign as low wealth persons. We can not only end welfare as we know it, but we can end the misery inflicted by poverty on our communities going forward. You know, I don't need to remind anyone here that according to analysts, the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit provisions, among others in the rescue plan, will do more to reduce child poverty in our country than all the empty rhetoric for the last 25 years about personal responsibility since we ended welfare as we know it. And we need to continue to promote these proven poverty alleviation efforts like the CTC and EITC. In 2018, the CTC pulled 4.3 million Americans, including 2.3 million children out of poverty. And if you're concerned about cutting poverty, oh, this is a great place to start. Children and families who received the CTC had improved overall health, performed better in school, earned higher salaries as adults. And this next budget should consider and build on the progress that we've made. You know, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, 5 minutes is just not long enough to revisit the 25 years since we ended it all. You know, and I was a state senator in 1996 when then governor of Wisconsin, Tommy G. Thompson, President Bill Clinton, Speaker Newt Gingrich, and luminaries on both sides of the aisle breached the social contract under the Social Security Act to protect the elderly, the infirm, the disabled, and children by snatching this protection singularly from children and relegating children's economic security to the vagaries of the marketplace. And as Governor Thompson, soon to be Secretary of Health and Human Services under President George W. Bush's compassionate conservatism so aptly observed at the time, plenty of jobs, of low-wage jobs, were available to women because of this government mandated market manipulation. And over the past 25 years, United States employers have enjoyed a reliable pool of workers captured in a system that paid minimum wages, or more often, the tip wage of $2.13 an hour, often less than 40 hours. And because TANF severely limited education and training and childcare to focus on workfare and these low-wage insecure jobs, and it severed the automatic entitlement to Medicaid and SNAP, there was no escape from this government mandated feminization of poverty. We were regaled with promises of lifting people out of poverty, of ending dependency, of restoring women's dignity by tying benefits to work requirements, drug testing, and time limits. Governor Scott Walker, Rep. Paul Ryan admonished us to accept the TANF program as a system that would provide a trampoline out of poverty rather than welfare serving as a hammock. And I hope my colleague Glenn Grothman is there, ever so romantic. He defended this policy as pro-family and pro-marriage. Not surprisingly, the welfare rolls precipitously dropped due to rules requiring strict work engagement rules and financial incentives to get to the states to get families off no matter what. 5 minutes is not enough time to review all of the literature on TANF after 25 years. However, briefly, according to CBPP's longitudinal study, deep poverty, defined as living on roughly $8.50 a day, has surged. And according to research by Luke Schaefer and Catherine Eden, households living in extreme poverty, defined as living on $2 a day, has doubled. My message is that we should keep on doing what we did in the ARP to begin a new conversation about addressing how we help the poorest truly escape poverty. I think it's time that we begin to discuss a new deal between the federal government and its people, as distinct from a contract on America that exacerbates inequities. We need a minimum wage increase. We got to stop pretending that we can just live off nothing. You know, we have got to, instead of us providing the poor with opportunities for upward mobility, we've relied on insulting people out of poverty. If we just call them lazy, ne'er-do-well welfare queens, if we demand that they get some dignity with that $2.13 an hour, plus tips, job, and promise that this would put them on a path to self-sufficiency, we do okay. The awful truth in America is that many hardworking Americans do not got more month than money. And it is the government's responsibility to do it. I just want to end because I know that the chair is indulging me. The reality is that people of all races, genders, and walks of life have needed and benefited from time to time from a little help. And the government has provided stability and to help people keep afloat when life gets tough. We need to reclaim our time when it comes to the debate on poverty and welfare, and the work of this committee will help us do that. And I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. Any questions of Ms. Moore? Seeing none, thank you to this panel. You're excused, and we appreciate your, oh, Mr. Tim, you're waving goodbye. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you very much. Our next panel at this point is Mr. Case of Hawaii and Ms. Bobert of Colorado. So I now welcome to the committee and yield 5 minutes to Mr. Case of Hawaii.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, ranking member, and colleagues from an early Hawaii, and mahalo for the opportunity to testify before you today as a former member of this committee in support of a fiscally responsible budget. At the outset, let me say very clearly that I reject the increasingly popular view that federal deficits and debt no longer matter, that we can somehow continue to endlessly spend far more than our revenues, endlessly increase our national debt with no consequence. Our debt now exceeds $28 trillion, doubling in just the last decade alone. Our debt to GDP ratio, measuring the ability of our economy to sustain that debt, is at its second highest level ever, exceeded only by World War II. Our own nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, in its recent Budget and Economic Outlook 2021 to 2031, published before the passage of the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, projects that in just another decade, debt will equal 107% of GDP, the highest in our history, and within another 2 decades, almost 200% of GDP. Even with record low interest rates, gross interest outlays increased 26% over the past decade, and we are spending more on interest than key investments in our future, such as transportation infrastructure and K-12 education. We can and should debate reasonable deficit and debt levels and whether to address them on the revenue or the expense side. Those are debates that need to be had. But I hope we can all at least agree that the current escalation in our federal debt is unsustainable over time and will increasingly harm our country across the board. I think the underlying challenge is our collective inability or unwillingness to recognize and prioritize fiscal responsibility and sustainability. Whether budgets, taxes, spending, pay-go, or any other fiscal issue, we're increasingly simply avoiding sound budgetary principles and practices and accelerating the decline in our nation's finances. More directly, several of our nation's critical trust funds, including the Medicare Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, the Social Security Disability Insurance and Social Security Old Age and Survivors Insurance, are now projected to run out of money within the next decade plus, much sooner than earlier projected as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. Against this backdrop, it is simply irresponsible to ignore our nation's fiscal state, and even more critical that our budget face up to these realities. We do not have to implement immediate draconian and counterproductive spending cuts and/or tax increases to do so. We can take balanced, preferably bipartisan steps to reinstitute fiscal responsibility and accountability, as long as we do so now. I want to highlight some basic budget reforms that I believe can contribute. First and most basically, I believe we must produce a detailed budget. It is a mark of deterioration over time in both finances and accountability that we must even debate this most basic step. Second, we must pursue efforts to responsibly utilize limited taxpayer resources. Unfortunately, terms such as, quote, root out waste, fraud, and abuse, unquote, and, quote, eliminate duplicative programs, unquote, have become proxies for political ping pong. But the desire to spend wisely should be, and I believe is, universal. As one step, last Congress, we enacted the Taxpayers' Right to Know Act, authored by committee member Jim Cooper, to require federal agencies to report fully on their federal program activities and publish that information online for direct public accountability. Further steps include strengthening the federal inspectors general offices, which were denigrated under the previous administration. Third, we should establish balanced bipartisan procedures that require us to evaluate and make the hard decisions necessary for true fiscal responsibility and sustainability. I have again co-introduced the Sustainable Budget Act to do so for our overall fiscal state, and will soon reintroduce the Trust Act, which focuses on the specific actions necessary to save our trust fund programs. Lastly, while we pursue these initiatives, we must avoid digging ourselves any deeper than absolutely compelled by crisis circumstances through abiding by our pay-go rules and statutes. Paying for progress is not stopping progress. We have time and again proven that progress and fiscal responsibility are not mutually exclusive, as demonstrated most tellingly by the Paid for Affordable Care Act. And we have proven that we can take the difficult decisions on spending constraints and revenue enhancement necessary to do so, and successfully explain to our public why those decisions are necessary. I urge this committee to lead our way back to responsible budgeting and sustainable budgets. Thank you very much for your consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Case, for your testimony. Does any member have a question of Mr. Case? Ranking member.
Just mainly a comment for Mr. Case. Would love for you to serve on the budget committee. So we definitely could use your voice. Look at the deficits and items. So hopefully you get back here someday.
Thank you very much for that comment. I'm busy on appropriations, but it's critical all across the board, ranking member. This should not be a partisan issue. I think we can all find a way to debate this and reach reasoned decisions, tough decisions, but reasoned decisions in a way that will place our budget back on a sustainable path.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any other member wish to ask a question? Seeing none, I now recognize the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Bobert, and I think I can speak on behalf of the entire committee in sending our condolences to you for the tragedy in your state. You're now recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee. You are a member of the committee, but welcome as a witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for your condolences. It's certainly been a rough past few hours for Colorado beginning yesterday. And so I do appreciate that greatly. Mr. Chairman, we need a real budget that puts the US on a path to fiscal solvency. Democrats are not serious about the fiscal health of the country. Democrats waited until we were nearly halfway through the fiscal year before they even brought forth an FY21 budget. We know this was a sham process and only meant to cram $1.9 trillion in new spending down the American people's throats. My children are affected through this. As if once wasn't enough, they're back at it again. This time, it may be a lot worse. Mr. Chairman, and my colleagues on this committee, federal deficits are on track to exceed $3 trillion this year, and the national debt will reach a new record. The Nonpartisan Committee for Responsible Federal Budget estimates debt will now total 108% of GDP this year, which will surpass the prior record of 106% set just after World War II. And it will rise to 113% of GDP over the next 10 years. That's by 2031. Irrespective of any potential economic feedback effects of the stimulus bills. The CBO had previously projected that debt would grow by $14.3 trillion from 21 trillion at the end of 2020 to 35.3 trillion at the end of 2031. With the Democrats' $1.9 trillion so-called COVID relief, debt is projected to increase by $16.3 trillion over that same period, rising to $37.4 trillion by the end of 2031. The Biden administration has talked about raising taxes in order to pay for all of this extra spending. Mr. Chairman, I submit we do not have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem. You can't tax your way out of it. I urge my colleagues to take the FY22 budget and as an opportunity, take this as an opportunity to show some restraint and fiscal sanity. That means we need an actual budget process that foresees the prioritization of limited resources. That's what leadership is all about. Mr. Chairman, I represent the people of Colorado's 3rd District, which covers 52,000 square miles, 47% of the state, and is the 2nd largest congressional district that is a non-at-large state, and 55% of the 3rd District is public land. So the decision the Biden administration made to shut down oil and natural gas development on public lands is a very big deal to us. Every decision about public land management and development is a big deal to us and other districts where most of the public land in our country is located. Mr. Chairman, that is why it is so important that the Bureau of Land Management headquarters stays in Grand Junction, Colorado. Grand Junction was selected for the headquarters location because of its substantial cost savings, travel accessibility, quality of life attributes, and increased representation among the communities affected by land management decisions. It makes economic sense and has already saved money. The Department of the Interior estimates that in 2021, the move will save more than $2 million in lease costs and $1.9 million in salary savings. Additionally, the agency reported a $1.9 million in savings on travel costs in 2020. And it makes the most sense that the decisions are made closest to the people, the land most directly impacted. Since 99% of the lands of the Bureau manages are west of the Mississippi, it only makes sense to have an agency located close to those communities that it serves out west. Keeping the BLM headquarters out west is one example of a decision that we can make to save taxpayer money and benefit those most directly impacted by the land management decisions. Mr. Chairman, as we contemplate the fiscal year 2022 budget process, I urge you to take this opportunity to put the country on a path to fiscal solvency and make wise decisions. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Jason Smith, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Boebert. Does any member have a question or comment about Ms. Boebert? Seeing none, thank you to Mr. Case and Ms. Boebert that you're excused from the hearing. We have one final panel, and that includes Mr. Larson of Connecticut and Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas. So Mr. Larson, welcome to the committee, and you now have 5 minutes for your testimony.
Well, thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Smith. It's an honor to be here. And I am here to discuss, and I see that the committee is blessed to have 6 of my colleagues from the Ways and Means Committee who serve on the Budget Committee as well, and they are very much aware and apprised of the issue I'm addressing today. I'm proud that we have a president who's recognized the truth about Social Security and retirement. Social Security is a sacred trust between government and the people. And this Congress, not the 116th, but it's part of Congress, but Congress has not taken any action with respect to Social Security since 1983. 38 years have transpired, and the gap, the disparity gap that exists between people who live and rely on Social Security, and for many Americans, 40% of all retired seniors, Social Security is their only source of income. And yet we see the great success of the program because Social Security, as you all know, is the nation's #1 anti-poverty program for seniors. It is also the #1 anti-poverty program for children as well. Roosevelt's genius was recognizing this, and both Democrats and Republicans over the years have come to share this. In fact, it was Bob Dole that led the charge in 1983 in the United States Senate to make sure that we were reforming Social Security in a way that is going to be there for future generations. But let's make it clear too. The debate in Congress more often than not gets politicized and gets away from the facts. The fact of the matter is that Social Security is not an entitlement. It's an earned benefit, something that people have paid for. How does every American know this? Because all they have to do is go to their paycheck and look at where it says FICA. That's not an entitlement. That stands for Federal Insurance Contribution. Whose? Theirs and yours. And people make that weekly, biweekly, monthly, however their payroll check divides. And those companies who also participate, of course, as you know, get a tax write-off. Here's what's staring us in the face. Where we stand right now is that there are 10,000 baby boomers a day who become eligible for Social Security. That's 10,000 a day. Congress is last taking action, as I said, in 1983. We're long overdue to make this program sustainable for our people. Sustainable in a way that it continues to both help them personally and their local economy. And we don't often look at Social Security as an economic stimulus, but we should. Mr. Chairman, in your district, you have approximately 150,000 Social Security recipients who receive $207 million monthly that come into your district. Mr. Smith, Ranking Member Smith, you have 189,000 Social Security recipients in your district and 230 million. Where does that money go when it comes into a district? You all know it as well as I. It's spent locally within your district, at the grocery store, at the pharmacy, at the dry cleaners, and I could go on and on and on, but you get it and understand this. Congress is long overdue to step up to its financial responsibility to the citizens we are sworn to serve, and to make sure, as President Biden says, that we honor the sacred trust that exists between the people who have paid into a system anticipating that they will receive a benefit. It would break your heart to know that there are 5 million Americans who have contributed all their lives into a program and yet get a below poverty level check from the United States government. Clearly, in the wealthiest nation in the world, we have the ability, and it's the ability relies on Congress taking action. So the responsibility is ours. And either we're going to step up and take the initiative, or take the mirror test, look in the mirror and be honest with your constituents and say, no, we didn't take any action. That's why your benefits have decreased, have remained the same, and haven't kept pace with what we need to do. We've got a proposal. We're working directly with the president as well, but we would love to see this bipartisan. Over 208 Democrats have signed on to Social Security 2100. to not only make sure that nobody can retire into poverty who's worked all their lives and paid into a system, but also make sure that we actually, as the AARP has recommended, have a system that keeps pace with inflation, something they would call CPI-E, E standing for elderly in this instance, but making sure that the monies that they receive are keeping pace with the cost of living. Again, noting that Congress hasn't taken any action in 38 years. So we're overdue for that action. We also know that people are working beyond age 65 and some into their 70s out of necessity. We shouldn't be taxing their Social Security at that point as well. And so the proposal provides that more than 12 million Americans will receive tax breaks as well. And in many states, people are penalized because of WEP and GPO and have paid into a system, or spouses have, and yet they don't get the money back as well. All of this
If the
requires
gentleman can wrap up, please.
I'm sorry.
Way over your time.
All of this, I'm sorry, forgive me. But thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Chairman, and to talk about Social Security, something I know all of you know and appreciate, and look forward to working with you on this, and happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Mr. Larson. Yes, Mr. Donalds has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Larson, thanks so much for bringing up an issue that I think is actually does need to be discussed in great detail by Congress. I actually agree with you. For the members, and I'm not going to get into an extended remarks before I ask my question. But in my professional career, I actually spent a lot of time working with retirees on Social Security and the different dynamics, how it impacts their retirement, how it impacts their savings, how it also deals with their retirement accounts to essentially try to keep them from actually having to go back to work later in life, so that they had the necessary dollars they needed to survive and pay for healthcare and pay for living and just enjoy their retirement years. My question is simple, Mr. Larson. I was listening to what you were saying intently. What are the actual elements of your plan or the president's proposal? I didn't really pick that up. I just really want to know what the elements of that are.
Well, the elements are, and I think you especially will appreciate this, having, looking at your district, having more than 233,000 Social Security recipients, and the district receiving 368 million that come
Good
into
morning.
the district in monthly payments. So what the bill is designed to
Thank
do
you.
is to take Social Security first and make it sustainably solvent. Second, to make sure that nobody who's worked all their lives and paid into a system can retire into poverty. So the new floor for Social Security will become 125% of what the poverty level is. For people who continue to work and have paid into the system, and I'm sure in your case, that's many in Florida, they wouldn't be taxed on their Social Security benefits as they're working. Above, unless they're above a certain pay grade, et cetera. And also that we want to make sure that this program is sustainably solvent, primarily because millennials, and I think this is equally as shocking, for most of them, they have not had the opportunity for personalized savings. On the Ways and Means Committee, we're trying to do both with the Secures Act and enhancing opportunity for people to put money aside, but also make sure that what we're asking people to contribute to is sustainably solvent and actually works for them back in their district. We haven't done that. And so the gap continues to grow because of Congress's negligence. There's no one to blame other than Congress. And the fight usually stems around, well, are we going to raise taxes or cut benefits? And that's a false fight too. What we have to do is take a look at the need that people have and then make the adjustments accordingly, whether that's, lifting the cap, whether there's a whole host of ways that this could be addressed. And we would appreciate the input from members of the Budget Committee on that as well.
Thank you. Oh, yes, sir.
Chairman, quick follow-up on that.
Sure.
I do understand the argument about raising the floor to 125% of the poverty line. I guess my question is, where does the funding come from to do that? I think everybody on the call is quite aware of the issues we are having with the fact that there are less working Americans per retiree on Social Security and also on Medicare for that matter. It's been decreasing for the last 60 years in the United States without question. Also combined with the fact that the truth of the matter is, because of the wonders of our healthcare system in the United States, that Americans are living significantly longer than when Social Security was created. Life expectancy since 1983 has increased by 5 years.
And so,
to today.
like it was
and so
in
my question is,
19
what is the actual mechanism that you're proposing we use in order to raise that
the
floor?
exact mechanism that we currently use. The deductions are made. And so you have a couple of choices here. You know, of course, as I'm sure everybody on the committee does, that you stop paying into Social Security, it's not deducted from your payroll after $139,000. So a person paying $50,000 proportionally pays far more than a person making $400,000. Lifting the cap, especially starting with higher income people, on having them continue to pay into the system the same way that someone making $50,000 in Florida does, is a good starting place. And then I think, again, because of the economic times that we're in currently, difficult as they are, talk about phasing in an increase so that the increase matches a benefit. So even if you were to increase a program 1%, but that doesn't kick in until 10 or 15 years out in the future, kind of what they did back in 1983. We have yet still, we're going to experience another cut in Social Security as the age goes up again in 2022. Congress did that in 1983. It's up to this Congress to decide whether or not it's going to face up and say, okay, this is how we want to approach this. Again, to your point, giving diminished amounts of the workforce, but not at diminished amounts in the economy and what the economy produces and what it generates in terms of prosperity, except that has become increasingly more one-sided and leaving behind all these people who worked all of their lives, especially in professions that weren't paying the kind of salaries that I would dare say most of the members of Congress make.
Mr. Chairman, if you would indulge me, one last question on this matter.
Go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. So from what I'm gleaning, the primary proposed fix is to remove the $139,000 cap on Social Security taxes. So if you have an American who's making $145,000 and now that the cap has been removed, are they going to get, frankly, the increased incremental benefit when they retire, simply because now the cap has been removed from on their earnings?
The proposal would actually be to lift money on people above 400,000. The cap currently exists at 139. You could lift that cap as well. That would be a way to pay for it. But under the proposal, it's to lift the cap on people earning over $400,000. And yes, would they receive more of a benefit? Yes, slightly more of a benefit, because that's the way that the program is designed. But I think many, especially in that category, would argue that they probably don't need all of that benefit, but nonetheless, that was the principle behind Social Security as well that Roosevelt instituted. So the bill does not currently include lifting the cap on people making $139,000, but it does include lifting a cap on $400,000, people earning above $400,000. But any input or ideas that you have with respect to that as a way for us to make sure that people in your district and everyone's district are getting what they deserve.
I'm good, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your indulgence.
Absolutely. Thank you for your questions. I would just add that another argument for significant immigration reform is that it would bolster the finances security of Social Security, because you'd have a lot of young people coming in, paying into the system who would not draw benefits for many years. That's another subject for another day. We've also added, just for your information, we have two more witnesses. Mr. Gomert of Texas is also part of this panel. He will be our last witness. Now you have 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, who is also a member of the Budget Committee, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I am delighted to be here, and thank you to the ranking member and the chairman for this hearing. I am a member who is honored to serve on this important committee, and I share my priorities for the upcoming fiscal year. Want to do something we do not often do enough, and that is to say thank you. Thank you for the great work the Budget Committee has already done. Mr. Chairman, as you well know, when you came in the 117th Congress, America was in the grip of a lethal COVID-19 pandemic, which has now claimed the lives of over 500,000 persons, including fathers and mothers and grandparents, siblings, friends, neighbors, loved ones, Americans, healthcare workers, and first responders, Americans, and those within our border. The pandemic left our nation's economy in shambles. Millions were left jobless, food insecure, schools were closed, small businesses were shuttered, and vaccine distribution was a disaster, but bold action was needed. I'm very glad to be part of the committee majority, the Democratic congressional majority, and the incoming Democratic administration that led by President Biden, that promised the American people that the days of chaos and confusion and blame were over, and that help was on the way. And help has been delivered. In the name of the American Rescue Act, now helping over 18 million people unemployed. And now I can say the words that help is here. Delighted that money is being put in our pockets and shots are in their arms. The plan will mount a national vaccination program. $2,000 that was promised is now coming to the bank accounts of our fellow Americans. 40 million Americans can expand access to safe and reliable childcare and affordable health care. The plan delivers $170 billion for education, $45 billion for childcare. And the lion's share of those dollars coming to cities and counties like Houston and Harris County, where they're getting billions of dollars. And I'm delighted that my motion to instruct was accepted in the Budget Committee, that indicated that we would prohibit any removal of the language in the American Rescue Act that would provide direct payments to our local governments. Mr. Chairman, I want you to know that Houston and Harris County wanted to give you and the congressional Democrats a resounding applause for allowing those direct payments to come to our local jurisdictions. As well, our school districts are getting money. And of course, the premium pay for eligible workers performing essential work up to $13 per hour will be provided. And what is so necessary in Houston and Texas after the freeze, thank you for making necessary investments in water, sewer, and broadband. But now more work has to be done, even in spite of the child care tax credit of $3,600 and $3,000, which will put as much as $10,000 in the pockets of our fellow Americans, and the extended unemployment. What has to be worked on is, of course, the issue of income and retirement security. I'd like to join in Congressman from Connecticut on his legislation that I've supported. But in the meantime, we realize that many years, our 65-year-olds and older do not get any COLA. So I'd like my bill to be considered the Social Security Safety Dividend Act, which provides a one-time payment of $250 to seniors when there's no COLA. By 2035, Americans aged 65 years and older will outnumber children under the age of 18 for the first time in U.S. history, and ensuring that current and future generations of seniors are able to enjoy a financially secure retirement is one of our greatest policy challenges. Social Security should be protected. Women and minorities are especially at risk of retirement. In addition, Medicare and Medicaid must be lifelines for seniors. Seniors use Medicaid in their nursing home, and it is extremely important. I would also ask that my COVID-19 Delivery Act of 2021 be considered in this budget process. That is to provide for pandemics going forward, to establish a firm delivery process that impacts the budget. We lost lives and lost income because we could not deliver not only vaccines now, but testing. And so that is an important legislation that has a structure for apps a structure for a communication between agencies. I also want to make sure that we have a strong infrastructure plan. It has been demonstrated time and time again that for every dollar invested in infrastructure, at least $1.63 is economic activity. In the Biden recovery and the Obama-Biden Recovery Act of 2009, it created 1 million jobs when we invested in infrastructure. I want to make sure that we include in infrastructure, light rail, major flood and water, which is not often focused on, small bridges repair, and yes, housing, which is a new addition to ensuring that those concerned with infrastructure also realize that people are unhoused. Congress must act boldly and decisively in the area of transportation to ensure that the necessary investments are made and equitably distributed, not just to bi-coastal areas, but all areas, including funding for light rail. Those of us that are in the South and the Midwest are often left out because of those formulas. I know there's a transportation committee, but I believe we can be very helpful in guidance. Also, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act should be part of any transportation funding. The Texas Department of Transportation has ignored its responsibilities under the law and obligation to marginalized communities, low-income communities, Independence Heights, near North Side, and as well, cultural and historic communities. That is absolutely unacceptable. Criminal justice reform and reparative justice, we should make sure that in criminal justice reform and budgets, that we realize that restorative justice is important and mass incarceration should not be the future of the 21st century. Let me finally, as I conclude, Mr. Chairman, say that I am the author and principal sponsor of HR 40, which establishes a commission to study the effects of slavery on modern day America and to recommend proposals to eliminate remaining badges and vestiges of oppression. Let me be very clear. We understand that this is looking at the landscape of what happened and the continuing impact of disparities that we'll find in the African-American community, well documented. A Harvard University study at the Harvard University Medical School indicated that if some form of reparations, access to healthcare had been given to African-Americans before COVID-19, this is a peer-reviewed study, they would not have suffered in hospitalization and death that occurred in that community in the COVID-19. Finally, on March 4th, 1865, in the incomparable second inaugural address, President Lincoln spoke of the harm to the nation resulting from the bondsman's 250 years of toiling in slavery. And so it is therefore appropriate that 150 years later, we examine, we study in order to respond what that meant and what the disparities meant. I asked Mr. Chairman that the Harvard University study be submitted into the record. And I also asked unanimous consent that my entire statement be submitted into record to make sure that that happens. With that in mind, I thank you so very much for yielding to me. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. It will be included in the record. Does anyone have any questions of Ms. Jackson-Lee? All right, seeing none, now welcome to the Budget Committee and yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert. Please unmute. Mr. Gohmert, unmute your mic.
All right. Okay, thank you, Chairman. And good morning, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee. It's truly an honor to speak before you today regarding serious issues relating to our nation's budget. With our national debt now heading toward $30 trillion, the supreme urgency of this matter actually grows by the second. Over the last 20 years, our national debt has skyrocketed to unsustainable levels. This spike in spending has put our economy at risk and worse, saddled the next generations with undeserved fiscal burdens. Like I said, the situation worsens by the second. In the past, I introduced the balanced budget amendment that would accomplish the following. First, it would require that total spending for any fiscal year not exceed total revenue for that year, and that total spending never exceed 18.5% of GDP. Mandate that the debt ceiling is number two, mandate the debt ceiling and taxes can only be raised with 3/4 of both houses of Congress instead of with simple majorities. And then third, require the president to submit a balanced budget or else risk impeachment. The decision to introduce my balanced budget amendment was made in order to try to force us to make the needed fiscal reforms before insolvency makes those decisions for us. This resolution takes a common sense approach and will be a major step forward in regaining the trust of the American people. Another important bill is the Zero Baseline Budget Act, which is designed to cut wasteful spending by amending the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1995 and eliminating annual automatic increases in the budget. This legislation would accomplish the following. First, amend the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985 to change the method of CBO that they use to calculate the official discretionary budget baseline that accompanies the budget process every year. Number two, eliminate any automatic increases in the baseline for inflation or any other reason and exclude emergency and supplemental spending. That's been a problem because we appropriated supplemental spending or emergency spending, and then that gets lumped into the budget for the next year, which defeats the purpose of calling it emergency spending. But number three, when the bill becomes law, the CBO baseline for the next fiscal year will simply be the aggregate of the appropriation bills that are in effect for the current year, excluding emergency and supplemental spending. Therefore, the Zero Baseline Budget Act makes level funding the official CBO baseline for discretionary spending. It's long past time to get our fiscal house in order. It's apparent America is on a road headed for ruin if we continue to spend money federal government doesn't have. I'd also like to point out, and I appreciated Mr. Larson's testimony about Social Security, but there are parts of Social Security that are not paid for by the people that are receiving it. And in fact, I was surprised when I got to Congress to find out that there's no cash, there's no money in the Social Security Trust Fund. That I was surprised. I thought it was more modern development, but apparently when the very first money started rolling in the 1930s from Social Security tax, it went right out the door being spent in the general fund. And that's something we really need to stop. And I agree with Mr. Larson 100% that Social Security benefits, if there are benefits to which the receiver had paid in, that they shouldn't be taxed. And of course, that helped when that taxing occurred in 1993 or 94. That helped the Republicans take the majority back. Seniors got rather upset about Bill Clinton and the Democrat majority taxing their benefits. So I would be glad to work with Mr. Larson to pass a bill to stop that. And I know our seniors would appreciate it. In the meantime, I'm very grateful for this time, and I really appreciate you all listening to rank and file members about things we need to do. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mr. Gohmert. Does anybody have any questions of Mr. Gohmert? Mr. Good.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Gohmert, and thank you again to my fellow committee members and the other panelists who've appeared today. Mr. Gohmert, I want to commend you for your common sense, specific proposals to be solution-oriented. I have long maintained that our national debt and our spending is one of the greatest threats to our republic, and a day of reckoning is coming. Many others have already pointed out on this committee and in previous debates and discussions, you know, we are racing towards $30 trillion in debt, which equates to some $90,000 per citizen. And I've heard it said by committee members here and members on the House floor that, hey, we'll never ask people to pay that back, as if it's monopoly money, as if it's not real, as if it doesn't count. And you know, the interest on the debt alone is climbing as a percentage of our budget and our spending now, and it's projected to just multiply in the decades ahead. And it's really a travesty for us to leave that to future generations. You know, we're again at some $90,000 per citizen on average out of 330 million citizens for $30 trillion worth of debt. And so I just want to thank you for your common sense proposal. It's timely. We're looking at $3 trillion more in spending that's being threatened by the majority. I'm in favor of investment in infrastructure when you have the resources and the fiscal management to do it, but we're not in a position to do that, sadly, because of what we've done. And both parties bear responsibility, and so I don't excuse when our party has been guilty, but together we've got to be solution oriented. I thank you for what you've shared this morning, and I support the suggestions that you've made. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Good. Any other member have a question or comment? Well, seeing none, thank you, Mr. Gomer. You and the rest of the panel are excused, and that is actually the last witness. So we want to thank all the witnesses for being here today and all the members who took the time to listen. This completes our business for today. I want to ask unanimous consent that members have until the end of the day today to submit any written materials for the record. Without objection, so ordered. And again, that completes our business for today. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.